Crash Training Podcast. We're going to help you work to restore or preserve the highly perishable skill set of crash reconstruction. Okay, everybody, welcome to episode number 4 of the Crash Training Podcast, brought to you by Crash Training Solutions. I am Bobby J. Mullinax, your host, and today we're going to start that 3 or 4 episode deep dive into the minimum speed equation. And today we're going to look at specifically when we just calculate that minimum speed equation of 30df, what are we actually even calculating? A lot of people always want to equate this to a speed or a speed change, and that's not always the case. And that makes it a little confusing, especially when you start getting into multiple surfaces or slides to impact and things like that. So before we jump straight into the episode, I'll go ahead and address the elephant in the room. Yes, there was a little bit of a hiatus between episode 3 and episode 4. Just a few, 3 or 4 months or whatever it was. And the reason for that, a very good reason for that, we were juggling a lot of stuff at once, and we had to kind of put the podcast in hiatus mode just for a little bit until we could really devote enough time to it to properly pull it off and make it, the best possible content that we could to put out to everyone. So while we were away, we were actually working on a lot of different stuff with our online virtual training, and we were working very diligently to try to get all those courses into a on-demand type of delivery, and we're just about there. So within the next few months, probably by the beginning of 2022, just about every course that we offer is going to be available on demand. Register and start the same day, which is going to be a very, very good thing as far as training and flexibility and all that is concerned. Another thing we were working on, I'm getting ready to make the announcement on LinkedIn. I'm going to share a video of exactly what we've been up to, and I'm very excited to share that video with you probably Monday or Tuesday of next week. So we're looking at maybe October 4th or 5th, somewhere in there. We're going to drop that video and show you some things that we're getting ready to implement in our training programs that is going to change the reality in which you view virtual training. So that's something we've been working on. Something else we've been working on that's getting ready to drop next week as well. I'll tell you about that at the very end of the episode, just so you'll know what's going on there. So a good reason we've been away, but we're working very hard on the podcast now. So we've even got a couple of episodes ahead, so we shouldn't have any more problems with any kind of delays or staying on schedule and keeping everything consistent. So I hope that those of you that were with us for episodes 1, 2, and 3 are joining us back for episode 4. And while we're talking about that, I just want to take a few minutes and say thanks to all our viewers on YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your audio format podcast. However you're listening to us, thank you for helping us make this as successful as we possibly can. So I thought that YouTube would be the main kind of viewing point for this, but we actually get more listens, I guess you would call them, on things like Apple Podcast and all that. So if you are listening on the audio format, or even if you're looking at it on YouTube, go to crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, and you'll be able to download all the accompanying slides and everything and get those visuals completely free of charge. So that's something that's available to you if you're coming across this on Apple Podcast or whatever, or even if you're on YouTube and you just want to get the visual add-on with it. Just go to crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast. You can download those there, and it is a very handy they are very handy. We've got a lot of good reviews. We've got a lot of listeners from tuning in from outside the United States even, which I was surprised of. But when I checked the analytics on Spotify or one of those, so we were getting listeners from the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Sweden, all over the place. Over in South America, over in Europe, London, all different places we were getting them, including way down in Cape Town, South Africa, where we've got the crash reconstruction team listing there on D shift. And I just want to kind of give a shout out to Patrick, Craig, and Jolene, and the rest of that accident team down there in Cape Town, South Africa. So it was very humbling for me to find out that they were using the podcast to help train officers all the way in South Africa from South Carolina. So I hope you guys are joining back in for episode number 4, and hope that you're staying safe down there in South Africa. So let's go ahead and get into the content for today, which is going to be talking about that minimum speed equation and what we're actually calculating. So let's look at this situation. We have a car that comes in, slides all the way out to a stop. Now, every now and then you make it a crash. It is just this easy. I've worked a handful of crashes with pedestrians or bicyclists, and the car or the driver hit them, realized they hit them, reacted to the sound, slammed on the brakes, and left 4 nice skid marks all the way to a stop. So in that situation, we probably want to know what his speed is here at the start of the skid. And in the instance that he goes all the way out to 0 miles per hour, we can use the minimum speed equation and figure out what his speed is there at the start of the skid. Now, where this gets a little confusing is when we have situations to where a car doesn't skid to a stop, or they skid to impact, or they skid over multiple surfaces and then impact something. And we're going to start looking at that more in the next episode, but we just want to look at what we're actually really calculating when we do this minimum speed equation. So we also know in this situation that a vehicle has kinetic energy. And kinetic energy, of course, is the energy of motion. And at the start of the skid, we know that he has some amount of kinetic energy. And if he goes all the way out, and at the end of the skid, he comes to a stop at 0 miles per hour, we know that his kinetic energy is also 0 foot-pounds. He has transferred all that kinetic energy into the work of stopping the vehicle. So for our example here, let's say that this takes place over 50 feet, and we have a drag factor of 0.76. If I want to know what the speed is for this vehicle, I can take this one distance and this one surface, and I can plug it into the minimum speed equation, which is speed is equal to the square root of 30 times distance times drag factor. Or if you're listening to us from outside the United States, you've probably seen it written out as speed is equal to the square root of 254 times distance times drag factor. And this is where some of the confusion comes in, because now that we have this minimum speed equation, people want to plug this in, especially on multiple surfaces, and they think that they're getting different speeds or changes in speed for each one of those surfaces. Just remember that this has a couple of different applications. If they go all the way to or from a stop, yes, that's going to give us the speed at the start of or the end of the acceleration. But if we are just doing this on one surface or even two surfaces, we're kind of accounting for the energy over the length of that skid. So you may have heard these also referred to as a speed loss. All right, a lot of people refer them to as a speed equivalency. So you may have heard them referred to as that. You may have heard them referred to as an energy equivalency. All right. You may have also heard them referred to as a kinetic energy equivalent speed. And that's all, different terms to say basically the same thing. When we use this formula over here, we are coming up with the equivalent speed as it relates to kinetic energy. All right, so that's where the kinetic energy equivalent speed, things like that, comes into play. To make it a little easier to understand, I also kind of like to refer to these as a could have been going speed. All right, so if I go out and I measure 50 feet and I come up with a 0.76 drag factor and I determine what the speed is, that car could have been going up to that speed and still came to a stop with that distance and that drag factor. And in this case, he does, because his ending speed is 0 miles per hour. So let's work through this to make a little bit more sense. If I want to take our earlier example, I'm going to see what the speed is, I'll say speed is equal to the square root of 30 times distance times drag factor. So speed is equal to 30 times 50 feet times that 0.76 drag factor. I multiply everything straight across. I'm going to wind up with 1140 under the radical. And then once I square that, I'm going to get a speed of 33.76 miles per hour. So the vehicle had an equivalent energy speed of 33 miles per hour, and he could have been going 33 miles per hour and came to a stop in those 50 feet. And of course, in this situation, we know that our guy does come in, he does skid those 50 feet, and then at the end, his speed is 0 miles per hour. So in this case, the energy equivalency is his minimum speed because he got rid of all that energy on that one section of skid, if that makes sense. And it's going to probably start making more sense as we start getting into multiple surfaces on the next episode of the podcast here. But depending on where you had your early levels of reconstruction training, you may have had an instructor that showed you this, and then they may have put up this equation, which is the distance to stop when the speed is known and the drag factor of the roadway is known. So to kind of make this a little more clearly, or to make a little more sense, if I say the distance to stop from 33.76 miles per hour on a surface with a drag factor of 0.76, if I square 33.76, it's not going to be quite 1140 because we're going to lose a little bit in truncating and all that good stuff, but it's going to be 1139.73. Real close to 1140. Once we multiply 30 times 0.76, we're going to have 1139.73 divided by 22.8. And when we make that division, we're going to have a distance of 49.98 feet. So it's saying that on that surface, from that speed, the vehicle would need basically 50 feet to come to a stop. And in our case, we know that he did come to a stop in those 50 feet, and he got rid of that energy, transferred it into the work to stop the vehicle. And also, while we're looking at it, if I had plugged in, 1140 up here and divided that by 22.8, it would have actually worked out to be 50 feet exactly. So 49.98, 50, pretty much 50 feet. So we're good there. So we're showing that the distance is directly related to what was available to the driver. All right, so he could stop on 50 feet on a 0.76 drag factor from 33.76 miles per hour. So the speed, the distance, and the energy is all kind of relating to each other. So let's look at the energy part for just a second. Now, we know that our minimum speed equation comes from kinetic energy. And we know that our kinetic energy formula is kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 of an object's mass times its velocity squared. All right, and we know that we are eventually going to turn this into our minimum speed equation. And I'm not going to define this entire thing because I don't want everybody to get flashbacks and leave the podcast all at the same time. But we're going to work through the first couple of steps just so you can kind of see how all this works together a little better. So if you remember from when you saw this derived, if you've ever seen it derived before, the first couple of things we did was just make a few substitutions. We said that kinetic energy was the same thing as applying a force over a certain distance. So that would also be equal to 1/2 an object's mass times its velocity squared. So now let's say we're not going to look at the vehicle's speed so much for a second, but let's say that we still know that at the end of this skid he's at 0 miles per hour, but now we are going to assign a weight of 4,200 pounds to this vehicle. And we're still going to say that he goes 50 feet to that stop. If I want to figure out what the kinetic energy is, I could say that kinetic energy is equal to force applied on the vehicle times the distance. And if I've still got that drag factor of 0.76, it will take me 3,192 pounds of force to move that 4,200 pound vehicle along that surface. So I'm going to say kinetic energy is equal to the force applied to the vehicle, so 3,192, multiplied by the distance of 50 feet, and I work everything out, and then I'm going to come up with a kinetic energy of 159,600 foot-pounds. All right. And then you remember a later step, we also said that force is equal to the same thing as saying the drag factor times the weight. And we would just substitute that into our equation. So force becomes drag factor times weight. Kinetic energy becomes drag factor times weight times distance. So using the same thing, we would just say kinetic energy is equal to drag factor times weight times distance. So KE is equal to 0.76 times our 4,200 pound vehicle times our 50-foot distance. And when we work everything out, we're going to see that we still have 159,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. All right, and that's how much energy that vehicle is. It's going to take that vehicle to move those 50 feet on that 0.76 drag factor. So now let's look at how the energy goes back and equates to the speed. All right, depending on how much training you've had in kinetic energy or not, you may or may not have ever seen this equation. But this is how to convert an energy into a speed. So we say speed is equal to the square root of the kinetic energy times 30 divided by the weight of the vehicle. So in this case, we'll say our kinetic energy of 159,600 times 30 divided by the 4,200 pounds that the vehicle weighs. So we're going to wind up with the square root of 478,800 divided by 4,200. And when we make that division, we're going to wind up with 1,140 under the radical. We take the square root of that, and we're going to see that our speed is going to be 33.76 miles per hour. So when we make that formula, or we make that calculation with the minimum speed formula, and we say that that vehicle's equivalent energy speed, or kinetic energy equivalent speed, was 33.76 miles per hour, it is also saying that for that instance, that represents 159,600 pounds of kinetic energy. So it is a way to equate for the energy loss and account for that energy loss over that surface. All right, so we have our vehicle that comes in, and again, he slides those 50 feet to a stop. His speed is 0 miles per hour. He comes in with 159,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. He slides over that 50-foot distance on that surface with a 0.76 drag factor, and he does it from his initial speed of 33.76 miles per hour. So the 33.76 is accounting for and equivalent to those 159,600 foot-pounds of energy. Now, this is a pretty simple explanation because he comes to a stop. So we're only dealing with one surface. We're not dealing with any impacts or anything like that. So it's not as hard to kind of, get your mind wrapped around it if you've never thought about it as an energy equivalency before. So going back to the could have been going speed, he could have been going up to 33.76 miles per hour and then stopped in 50 feet got rid of those 159,600 foot-pounds of energy. He transferred that into the work to stop the vehicle on that 0.76 drag factor. So the speed is equivalent to the energy, and the energy is equivalent to the speed. All right? And that's going to start to make more sense as we look at the next episode, when we start looking at this vehicle, and maybe he goes across, a surface or two surfaces, and then he impacts something. Everybody gets confused because they just do that 30DF equation for each surface, and then they get confused because it looks like a car is speeding up and then slowing down and speeding back up, but yet he's coming to a stop and he's braking, so he should be slowing down. That always trips people up. So just remember, when you make that calculation, you're actually accounting for that equivalent energy. So you're kind of calculating for kinetic energy, or the equivalency of the kinetic energy, without actually going through and accounting for the energy, if that makes sense. So hopefully it does. If it's been a while since you've looked at it this way, or maybe you've never looked at it this way, hopefully everything is coming back to you or making sense if it hasn't before. All right, and that's going to wrap up this episode of the Crash Training Podcast. We're going to try to keep things a little bit shorter and kind of break up some of the longer topics into shorter segments. So the purpose of this one was just to look at that minimum speed equation also as an energy, and an energy as a speed. Because I know in a lot of reconstruction training programs, not a whole lot of time is spent on kinetic energy. And there's always a lot of questions about kinetic energy that kind of come up once officers get in the field or investigators get in the field. And it can be very, very, very useful information once you kind of get the grasp on it. So next episode, we're going to be looking at the same situation, but now we're going to say that he goes airborne at a speed. Maybe he slides across a couple of surfaces and then goes airborne, and we're going to look at how to calculate that and what each block is actually representing. Also, last thing I want to tell you is one kind of announcement that I'll let out of the bag here on the podcast without waiting to announce it on social media is, again, getting a great response from the podcast, but a lot of questions have came up, and we've got some feedback to where people would really like to be able to practice a little more often. So what we're doing, and it's going to be exclusive to LinkedIn, we're going to be dropping it monthly on our LinkedIn company page. So again, if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, just go to LinkedIn, search for the company page, and give us a follow. But we're actually going to be releasing a we haven't named it yet, but maybe it'll be the Crash Training newsletter or something similar. We're probably not going to break the bank on marketing a clever name for it or anything, but it's going to be some kind of newsletter that's going to release monthly, and it's going to contain 10 to 15 practice problems related to some of the stuff that we've been going over on the podcast, some of the stuff that you may not have been on the podcast yet, but you would have covered in your earlier reconstruction training. And that'll drop monthly, and then a few days later we'll drop a video kind of outlining and explaining all those answers. So that's something also that if you're interested in, be sure to go to our our LinkedIn page. Follow our company page on LinkedIn, and that's going to drop monthly starting next week, which is the first week of October 2021. So other than that, I appreciate you tuning in. And remember, if you want to get those visuals for this podcast, go to crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, and you'll be able to download all the accompanying slides and math and everything else. So until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode.